So, Theresa, I, like Cherie, have been doing some of this work, well, a little bit older than Cherie. I came from a police background in Philly for 10 years, then went back to school and got my degrees and ended up then becoming the EAP and opened that up into a larger position with the New Jersey State Police for 25 years, where I was on their command staff until I retired in 2013. And then, so certainly with that processing, I also was assigned to more than one, probably the first one in terms of a disaster response being 9/11. And in New Jersey, once they coordinated a team called Urban Search and Rescue, at 9/11, it was the Task Force 1. They now have 2 task force, and I believe there's 19 teams in the country that are official urban search and rescue teams. So I was at 9/11 on the date to begin that process of seeing what support was going to be needed for the New Jersey State Police and also the Urban Search and Rescue Team, New Jersey Task Force 1. Once that got underway, and years later, we utilized that same process again to go to Hurricane Katrina. There was what they call an EMAC, where the emergency management for the whole country asked for assistance from other states. New Jersey was one, and we went down to Louisiana for a 3-week period. And then again, it was brought in for Sandy in New Jersey, and I believe again down to the Virgin Islands and Haiti when there were different disasters down there. So let me just go back, and then you and I can begin maybe just talk a little bit about your involvement. So on 9/11, of course, when the planes hit the towers, everyone was coming from different directions, and certainly from the first responder directions. Maybe we can begin starting there with what your connection was personally, and then certainly with your family, because just so you know, Cherie, at the end of her interview today, did speak specifically about families that are involved, certainly from first responders that are traumatized through many events, and then also families in general with grief and loss and other extenuating circumstances that continue. Yesterday, when we spoke to Superintendent Sentnar, he had mentioned, which I do know this from being involved in the World Trade Center health program, that 14 additional members of the Port Authority, along with the 37 that were lost on that day, have since deceased because of different illnesses, cancer being one of the many that come under the auspices of some of those illnesses. So why don't we start there with what you personally, I believe you were in New York, or you worked in New York. Is that correct? Or you worked in Jersey but had business in New York that day, and then talk about your family involvement, and we can start there.
Sure. Thank you, Jim, and thank you for this opportunity. So on 9/11, 2001, I was on furlough from working at New York Life. I had started there just in January of 2001. And the project was going in such a way that they would furlough. I was a consultant at the time, and I was furloughed until expecting to be brought back in September of 2001. So I thought, wow, it was June. I finally get a chance to, I had 2 young daughters at the time. I could be around for them that summer, but I have a long career. Prior to that, I had worked in Manhattan for, at that time, it was about 15 years at that time. And so I live out here in Basking Ridge, and I was one of those long haul commuters. Yeah. And so on 9/11, I was actually with my husband and daughter. We were all off, and we took them to the YMCA for a gymnastics class. And I was, while they were in the class, I had said to my husband, I just want to jump on the treadmill. And as I got there, this was unfolding, and I had, didn't know where Tom was. Tom, my brother, Port Authority police officer, ESU unit, Tom Gorman. I didn't know where he was because, we didn't keep that much close tabs. And in his career, he started at the Newark airport, and then he was a PATH. He worked at the PATH, and this is where he was at the time. And I believe he was in the city at the time doing some paperwork, and he was about to get off shift when things had unfolded. And my other brother, so Tom's my older brother by 2 years. My brother John is younger by 2 years. And John was in the North Tower, 80th floor. And he worked at the time for Citigroup. And he was a senior leader there. And so as this was unfolding, we were, starting to call family, and, the horrible news that, he was over there. But we didn't, as things unfolded, we didn't know until days later what the extent of the loss was. And then, where was John? John was, because again, he had just changed jobs at the time as well. So I didn't even realize that his office was in the World Trade Center. And John made his way down to the lobby. And when I guess it was the South Tower that came down first. I always get this mixed up, but if I'm correct, he was in the tower that came down second. He made his way into the lobby, and then the other tower came down with all of the implosion, and he got up, found himself alive. He tripped over someone. He carried a woman out, and he survived, only to succumb to cancers in 16 years later. And my parents, obviously the devastation of losing Tom was significant enough. And then when John succumbed to the cancer, it was particularly too much for my dad. My dad is a brave, honorable, retired fire captain from Bayonne. And I say he died of a broken heart. He couldn't rebound after he lost John. He said just when he was starting to accept Tom, this happened with John. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the accumulation of the losses. My mom is probably the strongest woman that I know and love. And she's 89 now, in relatively good health, and just knows how to put one foot in front of the other and keep going and living a real positive. So she's my role model, certainly, as is as are my brothers in terms of my father in terms of their service.
Yeah. So then, Theresa, on that day, can you just talk a little bit about, it sounded like you said on day 3, which, while I was there, I certainly recall many, and Cherie touched on this today, as we would leave the Javits Center and go down to the World Trade Center in the very beginning week, we would travel by bus. It was a state police bus that would take us down. And people, there were a few things that were notable in terms of awareness. There were just regular New Yorkers, civilian New Yorkers that were lined up along West Avenue, handing out water and just being supportive of the first responders that were going down to the actual ground zero. And then there were other people that were lined along there holding up photos of family members. Of course, this was not just with first responders. This was for of the 2,900 and some that were missing at that point were missing. So can you just talk about that? It sounded like you said it took 3 days before you were notified of any whereabouts. So for 3 days, you knew that Tom was responded to the World Trade Center, not in Tower 2, where your brother
Well,
John
Tom,
was.
yeah. So John, we knew, within the day that he had, he made it out. But then my father and I gathered at John's house, and well, we had known through my sister-in-law, Tommy's whereabouts, that he was on site. And as you recall, we all held out hope. We didn't know where people were, who was injured, recovery, it's so chaotic. But that evening, my father and I, we made the posters, the flyers that John insisted to go back to look for Tommy. And I didn't. I had a 4 and a 2-year-old at the time, and I thought my place was to be with my family. But we stayed together every day, just holding vigil at my sister-in-law's house, hoping for word on Tom. There was this crazy scenario where someone from a hospital called that Tom was there, and it was a prank, believe it or not. It was the most horrible of pranks.
Yeah.
But yeah, so eventually we had to accept that he was, as so many, there were very few survivors. So it took many months before Tom's I think his gun belt was recovered, but there was never a body recovered from Tom's work there. There's been, the Port Authority has been phenomenal in terms of trying to give us, as family members, as much a timeline of their work and where they were at the time. And they've produced some documents around that. I've heard Tom on the radio responding, and that was the last that I was able to hear of.
Okay.
I'm on the job, yeah.
So then the Port Authority, the leadership were trying to keep everyone abreast within the organization, like your sister-in-law, and having different contacts. And then, so that loss, I mean, once you all, as a family, had that knowledge and reality that Tom was lost, that you then began a process of taking care of the arrangements or looking at arrangements. Can you tell me a little bit about how the family got through some of that from that perspective? Because you're the only one of us that are speaking that had a loss like this. So maybe you can give us some insight on through your grief and pain, and certainly observing your parents. You were in a unique position that your parents were involved in the grief, and your one brother was traumatized, John, no doubt, through this process. And you're now preparing, you're probably, did Tom have some children? Did you have nieces and nephews?
No, Tom had, both my brothers have had 3 children each. And so Tom's had 3 children at the time, 15, 11, and 9.
Okay.
Laura, Patrick, and Bridget. And Patrick is a Port Authority police officer today. He was one of he was the class of the first legacy of the
that's so awesome.
the 37 lost. Yeah. So Patrick is on the force now. And, I couldn't offer you that many details about the arrangements. That was my sister-in-law's. Everything about this was in support of her and the children.
Yes.
I was mainly concerned about my parents. Okay. And I think I've shared with you in another conversation, there's a subordination of grief that goes on, whether it's conscious or unconscious, and probably at the time it's unconscious, but all you want to do is take away the pain from people that were, so closely involved. And yes, I am. These were my brothers, but my day to day was intact. My day to day, I had my husband, I had my children. Like life. I mean, I didn't have a job anymore because things were not going to come back, but that was so inconsequential in the state of where we were in loss and grief. And so, Barbara, my sister-in-law, took forward how she felt. She wanted to, conduct his services, and they were absolutely beautiful. And it was, you really get the full impact of what it is to be a police officer's family member. It's incredibly honorable. The people that show up from all over the country, it was, it's really one of the most honorable experiences to be a part of.
Yeah, very nice. I've been to many of them, and I know for the Port Authority, I can recall at one point speaking to one of the bagpipers that just said, Jim, I'm getting burned out. I've been to 37 of these events.
Oh, I can't imagine.
And it's, but the commitment certainly from other brothers and sisters of the officers is just untouchable. It's untouchable.
Yeah, so, it's incredible. The trouble though today with the bagpipes, my mother to this day gets physically so upset when she hears Amazing Grace. Yeah. So of all the ways she has learned to move on, she cannot physically take that. She gets so upset. Yeah.
So that's many times trigger, and her trauma.
Yeah, that is her trigger. Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah. So then, Theresa, after things settled in that, maybe after the first couple of weeks, after the first couple of months, and as you mentioned, you were focused on family. You were with your brother's loss. You were focused on family, and then some other things as you went on forward. You certainly went back to work. I'm guessing you went back to work, and then you wanted to be involved in other ways, not just from the connection of your family, but just the main event, the whole event, and its impact that it had, certainly on PAPD. Can you talk a little bit about that? How you then began to look a little bit outside of the family and saying that you wanted to do more?
Yeah, I never did anything I consider to be grand in terms of never started a foundation as many have, or never even ran a fundraising golf event or anything. Okay. What I did was I chose to kind of serve as a means of handling my grief. And it's more, in a way, a conscious choice of how I want to live. So this duality of, I hated the people and their actions for what they did. And I honor that, it took so much from us, but that's not the way I live. I don't live with hate, as someone with hate or to broad brush any religion or culture or anything of that sort. So, but how do you reconcile that duality, right? I want to live with those. I have to live with those two feelings. So for me, the action that I took was how can I honor my brother's sacrifice and service, and it's to just choose to be of service and in whatever ways present itself. And so I hadn't gone right back to work because they weren't hiring people back right away. Things were still took some time to rebound. And I was writing an essay about my brother for a Mauger gym dedication. There was a Mauger school, and they dedicated the middle school gymnasium to my brother, Tom, who was a volunteer basketball coach. He was always there for his kids, right? And so I was writing about coaching, and I thought, oh, geez, coaching, that's a profession. Let me look into how I can be a coach. And through the work that I did in that way, because I was living, reinventing myself and kind of taking the events of your life and how do you incorporate them into your story and figure out what that is, and that informs yourself. And it was through that someone had gotten to know some public speaking that I've done, and somewhere connected me to Cherie, Cherie Castellano, and the For You New Jersey 9/11 program grant. And Cherie's reciprocal peer support model was the basis of how she wanted to support the grant. And that was, we're talking about a few years after 9/11, when the state of New Jersey said, people haven't dealt with their mental health, and how can we provide services? So I joined as a peer support counselor, and teamed up with a mental health professional. So I wasn't doing unlicensed therapy, but I had the perspective of having lived experience. And so I suggested, through the lens of people's careers, we could have people think about their mental health. And so, we identified the most affected communities in New Jersey, and we were on the road and did events at public venues and promoted the events, and together we provided a combined mental health and practical tips and ways to look at your career, and how do you reinvent, and what's your story. And it was very successful in terms of having people really open up and then pursue whatever counseling they could through the helpline. And for me, that was one of the most healing experiences I could have had, because then is when I really understood the healing power of being of service and taking your experience to share it in a way that can help others look at their own experiences with trauma. Yeah,
For sure. So then tell me a little bit about maybe after 10 years out, for each year as you went through this process with your parents and your brother John, and I'm sure the Port Authority were having anniversaries and some connection, through the years. I mean, all the way up until just this past year, which was the 20th anniversary. And just to note something, yesterday when I was doing the interview with Superintendent Ed Setnar, he had mentioned one of his very strong connections is that there are some of his police officers that were the sons of officers that were lost. So that was something that he wanted to highlight, and when we spoke yesterday, that was very important. So continuing with that theme, that every year, have you been involved? Has your mom and dad gotten in? I mean, I know for Cherie and I and some of my team that were there together, we, maybe the first 5 years, 6 years, we did go up to some area and celebrate. But then for the past 15, we do stuff on our own. We'll have a lunch, or we'll just text each other. Cherie and I always do. And now on this 20th one, I did go. I was asked to come up to the Urban Search and Rescue Group in Jersey for the 20th anniversary. So can you tell me a little bit about your experience and your families, maybe up through some of them, and then how you handled after that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the beginning years, we went as a family to as many events as were available, and particularly those sponsored by the Port Authority. Those were the ones that we wanted to be a part of mostly. And, with Barbara, with her family, with her sisters and their family, it was a large group, and we always went. And again, at the time when it happened, my daughters were 4 and 2. And I found that as I started going to these more and more, I couldn't unwind from the high of the support. And then you come into the reality of the day to day again. And these are just young kids. They don't know anything, you know, and I'd be giving them a bath and I get splashed and I get like I just found myself not able to manage that emotional swing that it was taking you on. And so I had to choose after a number of years to kind of pull away from that. Now, my father in particular pulled away sooner. He really was just so devastated by the loss. And I think, well, he had encouraged Tom to become a Port Authority police officer. And so he had a lot of probably some guilt on that. But anyway, it became harder over time to continue to do it. So I had to pull back. Now that creates a lot of, that isn't always understood, like we didn't want
Right.
Barbara and the kids to think that we didn't love Tom. We don't love them. But yeah, it wasn't an experience that was mentally healthy for us. For some people, it is. Like Barbara would never miss an event, and her sisters, and the kids were young, and so they went along as well. But for me, over time, it wasn't what I had to do, or what I felt was healthy for me. And certainly my dad, my mom would go sometimes. But what we migrated toward was the Middlesex Borough has and continues to have an event. Barbara had funded a memorial statue there, and they would have a 9/11 ceremony, candlelight ceremony. So in Little Middlesex Borough, very tiny New Jersey, quintessential Norman Rockwell, in my opinion, love it, so that's where maybe the last 15 years is where I really spent the time, made sure we were there. So my mom and I, when my father would go sometimes, but he and my brother, John, would go, and his family, and we would be there as representatives because Barbara and the kids were in New York with the Port Authority. Yeah. And then the 20th, I guess I kind of really said to myself, I want to do it my way, in a sense. So I donated platelets on 9/10. That's Tom gave blood on that was the last thing he did on 9/10. He gave blood. And so it's easy for me to give blood. And so I was able to give platelets as well. So I did that on 9/10, and then 9/11, I kind of just spent some time riding my bike and, thinking, and went in the evening with my mom to the Middlesex event.
Okay.
The 9/10 as well. There's a group called Heartworks here in Bernardsville that does random acts of kindness, and it was born out of the death of her brother-in-law, a civilian, and so they had a fundraiser, and I worked at that fundraiser, and then I got involved with the Tunnels to Tower fundraising for them, and did the walk run through the following week. So I kind of felt that I was able to honor my whole family in the losses, this time out. And it's, again, not to diminish anything that the Port Authority has done. They've done fabulous things. It's just sometimes, you have to kind of make a choice for yourself. What is really serving your mental health best under the conditions?
And Theresa, it sounds to me that you've learned a process of growing through grief, where certainly there's plenty of people that get stuck and very sadly can't get past some of that. But the other side of that is many people grow in grief in different manners. So everybody can continue to grow through a grieving process. And when I say grow, really meaning to get healthy with mental health, or get healthy with the trauma and the loss. Certainly it's coming to terms in another way with the person that you lost. So you found that you did find a way to grow through some of that grief. So then, Theresa, tell me a little bit about then what happened to your brother John, when it sounds like while you're growing through grief, this was another major curveball that you probably weren't ready for.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what to say. We thought he battled the cancer for a number of years because it would come, you thought it was under control, and then it would come back with a vengeance, and it kept coming back stronger and stronger. So it started in the esophagus and worked its way and finally took him through the brain. And, it was a matter of trying to connect. John, it was difficult because he had his own trauma.
Yes.
It was difficult to have him, to connect with him over that. He also had, his family and wife had taken another religious route through the Jehovah's Witnesses. So that created a difficult kind of pathway for us, because what usually happens is, you get together for birthdays and they don't celebrate birthdays, and then it's the holidays and we didn't have the holidays. So there was things, but he did what he had to do. I mean, his family, they've since moved on from that, but it created another challenge, and you have to, again, respect each other's process, right? And where they're finding comfort and support, and that was perhaps their route to that. So it's difficult because you're connecting under like this, because he wasn't one to really talk in detail about his experience. That wasn't necessary. We just knew it was.
Yeah.
Just glad he's alive, and so when it was, at least with John, there was the opportunity to say goodbye.
Yeah. So what year did John pass?
2016.
Okay.
Yeah. December. Yeah.
And then, which of course brought more pain to your family, more pain to your mom and dad, certainly. You were still the good daughter that was mindful of that and looking after your parents, I'm sure. So what happened to Dad?
Yeah, Dad, again, he retired early from the fire department, which might not have been the best thing. He was in his 55-ish, I guess. And reason I say maybe not the best thing, because he didn't have his work to occupy his mind. And he, so this, my father had a very tough life growing up. He was an only child, and his mother died at childbirth, and father was alcoholic. So there were, everything for my dad was his family, his nuclear family, and protection and
Safety and wellness. And
oh, exactly. Yeah. And on top of being a fireman, and it's just so we were his world. And then to have him lose Tom, it was just hard he never rebounded. He didn't seek, because he's from that generation, he didn't seek mental health services.
Yeah.
And fortunately, through my association with the 4U 9/11 program, Cherie and I not only worked under her leadership, we have a friendship to this day. and she offered to, speak to my dad, and she was the only one he would speak to. And that helped for him to, kind of get through and try to reconnect again with the family and find the joy in his grandchildren. And, it became particularly hard for him to be with Patrick, Tommy's son, because he looked so much like Tom, and it was painful.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll never forget, in both instances, I had to tell my parents that we lost Tom, because we were at Barbara's house all the time, and my parents weren't there at that moment. And that visual stands out in my mind, is just, my dad getting up and embracing.
Yeah. 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 Grief is a very difficult process that never goes away. Yeah. So Theresa, then your dad was heartbroken after the loss of John.
Yeah, I'm sorry you cut out there.
Then your dad was heartbroken.
Oh, yeah.
Earlier, after the loss of John's loss, his two sons, both connected certainly to the World Trade Center and to that event. So as much as he might have been gaining, even having you to support him and the family and Cherie, and he may have been coming out a little bit of the foxhole, and then the loss of your brother, John.
Yeah, it was too much. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, he just, he was ready to join them.
Yeah. So Theresa, that's 2001 to 2018 when your dad passed away. So that's 17 years. So it was 20 years ago when this occurred. So most of your life, and not your life specific, but a lot of your life, and certainly of your dad's and your mom's and your in-laws, and you really have been dealing with the trauma, the grief, through this process, through this whole process.
Yeah, I mean, like time like this, comes up.
Yeah.
But I think, we've all learned to put it in its place in our lives. I think, if I could just speak about my mom, because she's just incredible. Yeah. She could have been a very bitter, negative person. She's the total opposite of any of that. So it's not possible that, she would know any other way to live, and hell, if she can do it, I can do it. Anyone can do, that's the way I look at it. And you see it in each of their children. They're all but one are married, have their own grandchildren. There's 9 of them between them. And I think everybody lives in a way to want to honor them. Yeah.
So that does bring the term resiliency. And Theresa, I mentioned this to you when I did speak with you last week. That one asset or one attitude that I usually try to grasp from people that I speak with is things like pessimism versus optimism, or looking at resiliency versus struggle through trauma or that grief. And I said to you, I believe last week, that you are very resilient in your manner of not just getting through those 17 years to this place, but also, Theresa, being able to speak about it, which is what you're offering to many people that will certainly hear this moving forward, that you're continuing with some hope, or continuing with this resiliency that you do still see from, like you're mentioning, your nieces and nephews, and are moving through life in a healthy way. So you would agree that there is hope, or that some of the way that you process through this grief, that it did bring you to a place where you're growing through that grief to a healthier Theresa. Would that be a fair statement?
Oh, of course. I think I'll take credit for that. I don't know.
Very good, very
I
good.
but I don't, I think I've told you, I think it's in my DNA to, so there's a component of resiliency that
Yeah,
fortunately I think I'm blessed with from, my parents. But as you can see, one parent coped differently than the other. My father, but he also didn't have a base when he
yeah,
was growing up, right? So and he's from a different generation. And but I think, hope, that it all comes down to believing in a hopeful life. So I think I chose this paver for a memorial in Basking Ridge, and I kept thinking, what could I put that would have meaning to me later, in life, or anybody else reading it. And so I chose this paver, and it said, "Hope is the memory of the future." And I chose it because there is no future if you don't have hope. So that's all you have. So I think that if that your future self, you say, okay, future self, what do I have? Well, I always had hope to carry me through, like that. Yeah, that life can move on. I likewise, professionally and in how I conduct myself, I also subscribe to hope is not a strategy. So I don't just say, well, I hope that life will
that's good.
work out in the future. I think I also believe that you take action toward, and the actions you take cultivate the hope, because there's so many good people and there's so much support around you, and not being being open to receiving the kindnesses of
Very good. Very
from
well.
of people. Yeah.
Very well put. Yeah. Theresa, I could speak with you about this for the next 5 hours. I mean that. I truly mean that, because you are so open, and
Oh,
I
thanks.
do see the positive side, or the resilient side, that really is needed through this process, with all these years behind us, and probably continue that way. But I think your paver and your words here at the end are probably the best place for us to say thank you. This really has hit those nerves. And of the people that I've interviewed, Theresa, the three of and you may not know Ed Setnar. I knew him from the state police, and now he's the superintendent of police for the Port Authority, but a very heartfelt individual that cares in his leadership. And then, of course, Cherie, who I do feel has helped more people in first responder life than anyone I know. And then certainly your story, I think, is more personal and heartwarming from that place of hope. So thank you for doing this for us today. I really do mean that. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure again. Thank you for asking.